Okay, after that last video, I realized there were some finer points I wanted to make about this pronunciation story that I didn't fit into that previous video. So I'm going to make a hopefully brief postlude to that original video in which I go through some of these finer points, especially about acoustic phonetics if you're interested in that side of it at all. Not about acoustic phonetics, though. I wanted to also wrap up this discussion about, how do you actually pronounce the name of this city? And I pointed out that you can make a decision because the choice is up to you, basically. You can do it in at least one of two different ways. Uh, and actually, in my personal situation, um, normally I would say Kiev to my wife. There's no doubt in her mind about my sort of stance on the political situation with Ukraine. I fully believe that Ukraine should be an independent country capable of making its own decisions, and I love the fact that they're embracing democracy and moving forward towards a more sort of European style model of governance. And I fully support them in that endeavor. But with the name of this city, Kyiv is not super easy for me to say because I'm not used to producing the vowel. Kiev's a lot easier. Like I said, since Ukraine is a multilingual country, Svetlana is used to hearing people say the name of the city either way. She doesn't really care. You can choose to say it however you want in her presence, and I say Kiev, and she says Kiev, and it's fine. Right. So it doesn't mean anything political in that particular case. If I wanted to put more work into it, I would say Kyiv. Another funny thing, though, about my wife, though, is that she doesn't really like that vowel, that barred I vowel. She's kind of like aesthetically thinks it's not a great vowel to say. So I will say it's funny because my last name being Winters, or our last name now being Winters, there was a question about how to transcribe that or transliterate that name into Ukrainian when my wife got married and took that as her last name. So I'll actually pop this open here. And I think I'll just type these options in. But so, yeah, so the way I suggested we transcribe it is to use that barred I vowel. And I'm sorry, I should have done this ahead of time. And to transcribe it something like this, which will mean something to those of you who actually read Cyrillic, like winters. And it's kind of funny, actually. I'll mention along the way that so my wife's first name is Svetlana, and that so begins with SVIT. So I'll write this. Whoops, I'll write this in English so you can see it. SVITLANA. So Canadians, when they see this, they just stumble. They just have no idea how to say speet. So that SV combination really trips them up, and they usually come up with something totally unexpected, like Zvylana, or often we'll say Svetlana because that's the Russian version, but the Ukrainian version is Svitlana. But yeah, it's not easy to produce something you're not sort of phonotactically used to when you're speaking another language, or if you get sort of a non-native name that you have to say all of a sudden in just the normal course of speech. So I don't really blame them for that. But the funny thing is, her last name, Winters, is, easier for Canadians to say. Originally, my wife's last name was Filonic, which isn't too bad, but if you read this as an English speaker, you might not know exactly how it's pronounced. Winters is pretty straightforward, but if you are a Ukrainian or Russian speaker, then all of a sudden Winters just sounds really odd and exotic, and they don't know how to say it. So she's, no matter which country she goes to, as Svetlana Winters, people are going to have trouble with her name somehow. But anyways, what I suggested as a phonetician is that we use this barred I vowel for that first vowel in my name, the I vowel, the cap I vowel. And Svetlana was like, no, I don't like that name. I don't like that vowel. So I'm not going to transcribe it like that. I'm going to transcribe it like Winters. So now she's Svetlana Winters when she goes to Ukraine, not Winters, or however you would actually say that. It's not easy for me. Just like it's not easy for most Canadians who don't speak Ukrainian to say Svetlana. It's not easy for me to say Winters. So going back to that particular vowel. So yeah, so we kind of don't use the Kyiv pronunciation just because of sort of aesthetic reasons and also just ease of pronunciation reasons. It's not that big of a deal because like I said, the political situation or the political stance is not in doubt for us. So what might still be in doubt a little bit for you, and I'll say goodbye to this, I guess, is some of the things I said on this slide. I kind of glossed over it pretty quickly, but I have this transcription of, so originally for Ukrainian, I had that aspirated K, k, which I didn't really go to in detail. So K with an H after it, a superscript H. And then when we go to the Russian, also we get K with not only superscripted H, but also superscripted Yod right next to it, which looks like a J. And what does that mean exactly? So I kind of wanted to focus in on that a little bit. So first of all, here's one of my wife's pronunciations of the Ukrainian pronunciation of the name of the city.
Kyiv.
And I'll turn it up a bit.
Kyiv.
Right, so here's the K at the beginning followed by that aspiration. So there's a bit that it's just the K, 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 and then there's a H after it, which is actually a little crunchy in this particular case. Probably unintentionally. Maybe I didn't notice that. You know, you're going to get probably the same thing here.
Kyiv. Kyiv.
Yeah, maybe it's not as aspirated as I thought now that I'm listening to it closely. It might be a little bit of velar fricative there instead, in which case you would get a transcription a little bit more like this, like an X there is the symbol we use, Kyiv. But like I said, I think that's probably
Kyiv. Kyiv.
unintentional, and there's just a little bit of aspiration there, about 50 milliseconds. I've listened to some of what my wife says, her stops at other places of articulation, and they tend to be less aspirated or not aspirated at all if they're sort of the voiceless variant of the fortis variant of stops. So it's possible this is just, relatively lengthy aspiration for an unaspirated stop, or I don't think it's actually she intended it to be like an affricate, like a k affricate, just like k, or maybe trying to say a k unaspirated K and getting a little bit of aspiration out of it. Be that as it may, so I can show you. She gave me this kind of funny story about this word, and I don't even know if I wrote it down right, but it's she's like, no Russian can say this word right. And she said it means loaf of bread, and she actually gave me what she thought the Russian pronunciation would be.
Polonitsa.
But she wasn't too sure of it. She just knows this is how you say it in Ukrainian. Polonitsa. I think I got it more or less right. But this is the P at the beginning, the voiceless bilabial stop. It doesn't have a whole lot of aspiration. And in fact, if we zoom in, that's about 20 milliseconds of aspiration. So the K had about 50 milliseconds of aspiration, maybe 60, depending on the production. Yeah, so this might just be like an unaspirated stop that just gets sort of passively a little bit of aspiration along with it. We can compare it to the Kyiv pronunciation, in which there's clear aspiration, about 83 milliseconds of aspiration.
Kyiv.
And you can hear that pretty clearly. I'll play the whole thing with the initial release burst. So that's the aspiration part. And if anything, this sounds more like a palatal fricative. And I'm blanking a little bit on I won't do it there. The code for the symbol for that. Is it this? Oops, I got to get my IPA for that voiceless palatal fricative. Yeah, something like that, maybe. Kyiv. But the way I originally transcribed it is kind of what I want to talk about is that palatalization. And there it's written as that just the normal symbol for a voiced palatal glide, which is superscripted to denote that it's sort of superimposed on top of the stop articulation here. So if you listen to this closely, what that basically means is that when you're pronouncing this K at the beginning, your tongue is a little bit further forward than it might be normally. And you can hear that if we just play the K part of it. And we'll compare that to what we get for the Ukrainian pronunciation. So I'll just play the initial K part. So we can compare those two, and hopefully they should sound different. And this one is the one that's palatalized. And this one is the one that's not. if anything, it's velarized. You're pulling your tongue a little bit further back. Normally, the way I kind of describe this difference in intro phonetics is I say you can you say the words ki and ku in English, and you'll notice when you say ki and ku, one of the things that happens is that you round your lips for the oo sound in ku. So try to ignore that and just focus on what your tongue is doing for that initial K pronunciation. Feel where you're making contact on the roof of your mouth. So for ki, it should be a lot further forward on your palate than for ku, where it goes back towards your throat. Ki versus ku, or just, and that more or less corresponds to what we're hearing here. Versus, right? So this one is further back in the mouth,
Kyiv.
and that's actually one way you can try to get your tongue back to the place where it should be to pronounce this barred I right after it. And that, so instead of saying like kit, kit, where your tongue is still going to be fairly far forward for that I vowel right after it, which is in a fronter place of articulation. If you try to keep that tongue back, like where it would be for ku, and say kut, you're going to get more of a barred I vowel right after it, or Kyiv, which is actually, I think, more evidence for why this vowel is not the cap I vowel as it's transcribed here in the Kyiv article, or the Kyiv article on Wikipedia. It's a little bit further back than that. Normally, the two kind of go hand in hand in a language like Russian or Ukrainian, where you have a backer consonant sort of followed by a backer vowel or a fronter consonant when it's a fronter vowel. And the frontedness of that consonant is called palatalization. So to sort of just drive this point home even further, I've loaded up this example of me saying bridges, where I'm trying to produce that cap I in this unstressed syllable here. Something like that. Maybe a bit more. That's a better sample there. Normally you don't say just by itself. It usually has to be some sort of consonant after it. But it's that vowel. You can compare it to this. And if you look at it just in terms of its acoustics, you see that the F2 here is relatively high for me. F1 is relatively low. They're spread apart from each other. And then also for me, for this F2 and F3 are relatively close. When we look at my wife's formants, this F1 is relatively low still, but F2 is not really that super high. It's about equivalent frequency-wise to where my F2 is. And generally speaking, hers should be higher, so they're both around 1700 hertz or so. And then also you see this gap between the F2 and the F3. Which looks a lot different from what we get for a normal I vowel. So this guy over here is a barred I vowel. A little bit further back in your mouth in terms of where the tongue position is. And one way to get your tongue back into that position is to keep the tongue back for the K that precedes it. Kyiv, rather than Kyiv. I can't even do that. If you can't do it, you're doing it wrong. If it's hard to do, that's natural because you're an English speaker, probably, and not a Ukrainian speaker. But with a little bit of practice, you'll get there. You just need to find somebody, a spouse who is sort of not willing to let you be lazy about it and force you to keep practicing to get the Ukrainian pronunciation right. And you'll get there anyways. But like I said as well on this other slide, if you are trying to speak Ukrainian to a Ukrainian speaker, they're probably going to love you for it. So I'd encourage you to go out and do it as best as you can. Okay, that's it for the finer points. Hopefully that wasn't too long. And I'll keep going tomorrow.